Blood-stained prank. Robert, a prankster, had been planning his pranks for weeks in advance. He placed creepy dolls around the classroom and spread rumors about a serial killer on the loose. He convinced Mary to help him spread the rumors across the school, creating a story about the killer and even describing their appearance. The more believable the story, the better the prank, he reasoned. The entire school became terrified by the rumors, especially as Rob and Mary pushed it further, warning their classmates to be careful. Rob planned to dress up as the killer and reveal the prank in the most dramatic way possible. He believed this would be the best prank ever. Rob finally carried out his plan. He sneaked out of class, claiming he needed to use the restroom, and headed to the library, where he knew most students would be gathering for lunch. He donned his costume and hid behind a bookshelf in the library, preparing for his prank and eagerly awaiting the reactions of everyone. The alarm bell rang, and Mary, being part of the plan, was probably the one who triggered it. Excited, he rushed into the library, raising his arms to the sky, shouting,
"I'm the killer! I'm the killer!"
However, when he entered the empty library, he stood there, confused, looking around, trying to figure out where everyone had gone. Rob noticed something strange as Mary ran toward him, her face pale and wide-eyed with fear. She screamed at him to run. Her voice was frantic.
"Run, Robert! She's right behind me, the killer!"
Rob turned around, laughing, thinking it was just part of Mary's prank, but what he saw made him freeze in place. Rob saw a woman behind her, with black hair and one eye scratched out, almost hollow. Blood dripped from her eye, her mouth, and down her chin, creating a haunting appearance. Her expression twisted into a maniacal, blood-stained smile, exposing sharp teeth that ground together. When Rob looked back at Mary, he saw real terror in her eyes. She wasn't part of the prank. The woman's eerie smile sent chills down Rob's spine. At that moment, Rob realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't part of the prank. The woman was real, and she wasn't here to play or joke around. The woman lunged at Mary, knocking her to the ground. Rob was paralyzed with fear, staring as the woman bit into Mary's neck. His body froze. His mind struggled to process what was happening. Panicked, Rob grabbed a nearby book and threw it at the woman, but she didn't flinch. She kept attacking Mary. Realizing things had taken a dark turn, Rob fled the library. He ran down the empty hall, terrified as he heard the heavy footsteps and growls of the woman closing in behind him. Rob desperately ran toward the exit, but somehow the woman appeared and blocked his way. She raised a bloodied knife. Rob's breath caught in his throat as he tried to back away, but he stumbled over a chair and fell hard to the ground. The woman immediately grabbed Robert's neck. Rob struggled to breathe as his vision blurred while she tightened her grip. With all his remaining strength, Rob kicked her off, then sprinted toward the emergency exit, only to find it locked from the outside. He panicked as he realized he was trapped. The woman's maniacal laughter echoed down the hallway as she slowly advanced on Rob, the knife still raised. Rob desperately wanted to escape. As he neared the door, thinking he was about to escape, she swung the knife and slashed at his arm before he could flee. The woman continued laughing as Rob collapsed to the floor, unable to move. The scene was chaotic, like something out of a horror movie. As Rob drifted unconscious, he heard her final words echo in his mind.
"The last one, you will be the last."
He passed out, but his fate was sealed. The next day, news outlets flooded with reports of a school massacre where several students and staff had been killed. The police later revealed that the woman was a fugitive serial killer who had been evading authorities for months. The woman wasn't part of the prank. and she was responsible for a series of real murders. She was a serial killer who had been hiding in the school for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. After the massacre, a few people managed to escape, and some survivors, including Rob and Mary, were found. Both were treated in the hospital for severe blood loss. When Rob woke up, he was haunted by the nightmare that his prank had turned into a real-life massacre, and he knew he would never escape the terror of those final moments. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in dim streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store had closed, and the eerie silence surrounded it. Lena was the night shift manager. Usually, everything was quiet, nothing ever happened, and she would just stock shelves in the still hours while the world outside slept. Her focus broke when she heard a faint tapping. It came from the front of the store. Leaving her cart behind, she walked toward the noise. Through the large glass windows, she saw a man. Lena approached the glass door and asked what he wanted. He demanded she open the door. His face was blank, void of a smile, his cold eyes staring directly at her. Lena told him the store was closed, and he couldn't stay there. As Lena turned to leave, a loud bang made her jump. The man's fists pounded against the glass again, and again, each time harder and angrier. This guy wasn't just some harmless wanderer. She pulled out her phone, showing him she was ready to call the police. Only then did he step back, his glare still locked onto her, seething with rage. Slowly, he walked into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in her chest eased slightly. He was gone. She put her phone away and tried to refocus on work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, they all faded from her mind as she lost herself in stocking shelves. But then, she heard a metallic snap, like something being torn apart. She abandoned her cart and rushed forward, fear surging in her chest. Her stomach dropped as she saw the glass door cracked open. The lock, the only thing keeping it secure, was gone. Lena spun around, sprinting toward the office, but froze in place. Standing just a few feet away, blocking her path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still that cold, dead, furious stare. Lena didn't think, she just ran. She burst through the door, the man right behind her. Suddenly, an old, battered van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting her as it came to a halt. Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Lena stepped forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped. A sharp, sudden pain exploded in the back of her head. Lena's body lurched forward, collapsing to the ground. She didn't even have time to process what had happened before everything faded into darkness. Lena woke up with a pounding headache, her wrists tightly bound behind her back. The truck bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. Her mind was hazy, disoriented. For a moment, she had no idea where she was. Lena started piecing it together. The man. The truck. Maybe she had been kidnapped. Lena knew she had to act quickly. She glanced around. The interior was pitch black. But then, she spotted a pile of old tools, a rusty toolbox, and a few scattered metal pieces on the floor. Lena twisted her wrists, testing the restraints. They were tight, but there was just enough slack to give her hope. She could hear him muttering to himself up front. This wasn't over. Lena took a deep breath, pushing down the rising panic. She needed to think. She needed to get out. Lena inched closer to the toolbox, searching for anything sharp. It was difficult, but she found a small metal shard. Awkwardly, Lena maneuvered her hands, rubbing the metal against the rope. Every pothole in the road sent jolts of pain through her, threatening to make her cry out and expose her escape attempt. Suddenly, she felt the rope loosen. A few more scrapes, and it snapped. Her wrists were free, but she couldn't move too fast. Lena glanced at the front seat, where she could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't noticed she was awake yet. She spotted the unlocked door. She needed a plan. The truck slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was her moment. Taking a deep breath, she yanked the back door open and leaped into the night. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her body as she tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a moment, she thought she wouldn't be able to move, but then the adrenaline kicked in. Lena staggered to her feet, sprinting into the dense darkness of the trees. Behind her, the old van screeched to a stop. She heard the man shouting, but she didn't look back. She just kept running. Branches scratched at her skin as she tore through the dense underbrush. Her mind teetered between fear and survival. She could hear the man coming. She couldn't let him catch her again. Ahead, she spotted a clearing and the faint glow of streetlights through the trees. A road. If she could reach it in time, she'd be safe. Lena burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving her arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded her, but she didn't care. She threw herself in front of the vehicle, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and she collapsed onto the pavement. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but Lena was too weak to respond. All she could do was whisper, "Help." The driver pulled out a phone and called the police. Through the haze of exhaustion, Lena could still make out the blurry figure of the man standing at the edge of the woods, staring at her with furious eyes. But he didn't come closer. Maybe he knew it was over. Lena was taken to the hospital after everything that had happened. She later learned that the man had been handcuffed not far from where she had collapsed. He had been caught. The police assured her he would be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. Though she was safe, the thought still haunted her. What if she hadn't escaped? What if she hadn't been fast enough? The fear lingered at the edges of her mind, but she was alive. She had survived the night. The ghost house in the forest. His name was Lucas. It all happened during a hiking trip 3 years ago. He always loved spending time in nature, and he had gone hiking near the White Mountains of Utah. Whenever he went hiking, the surrounding nature was so breathtaking that Lucas lost track of time. Realizing the sun was setting, Lucas felt a bit hungry and sat under a nearby tree. Since he still had plenty of time to get down the hill, he decided to eat first to regain some energy. But today, it seemed to be getting dark unusually fast. He took out his flashlight and shined it ahead just as a massive bolt of lightning struck in the distance. Looking up at the sky, he noticed dark clouds gathering, ready to pour down at any moment. Feeling a bit anxious now, he quickened his pace. The dark clouds rumbled above, and the wind picked up speed through the forest. After 15 minutes, large raindrops started falling. The heavy raindrops almost felt like they were piercing his skin. Lucas started running, but his foot got caught in a hole, causing him to stumble and fall. Soon, his flashlight stopped working, plunging him into near total darkness. Frightened, he somehow managed to get back on his feet. But after walking for another 10 minutes, he realized he was hopelessly lost. He checked his watch. It was 8 p.m. He should have been off the hill by now, but things kept getting worse. Suddenly, an idea struck him. He climbed the tallest tree nearby, pulled out his binoculars, and scanned as far as he could. Lucas spotted a yellow light in the distance, on the left side of the forest. He zoomed in and saw a cabin standing there. Without hesitation, he climbed down the tree and started running toward it. Desperate to survive the night, he reached the cabin, panting heavily. Knocking on the door, he called out,
"Is anyone there? Please open up."
At that moment, he was nearly in tears. Then, The door creaked loudly and finally opened. A man opened the door and smiled, saying,
Dear Lord, what happened to you? Please, come in.
Without hesitation, Lucas stepped inside. The cabin was old and somewhat rusty, with a small fireplace in the center. After a while, a woman entered the room. She looked weary and sorrowful. The man explained that she had been suffering from a chronic illness for a long time. She gave him an eerie smile and then mentioned her son, Jimmy. She said he was a mischievous boy who always drove her into fits of rage. Lucas forced a weak smile in response. As he looked around, he found it both surprising and strange that they lived in such isolation. There was no sign of a vehicle nearby. Lucas wondered how they managed their daily lives. Perhaps they were just accustomed to this way of living. The man led Lucas to the guest bedroom at the end of a narrow hallway and told him he should lock the door for safety, as his son Jimmy could sometimes be a bit mischievous at night. Lucas lay down, drained of energy, hoping the storm would pass while he slept. But then he heard it, a soft giggle in the darkness, a child's voice, whispering and laughing in the shadows. He had forgotten to lock the door. Lucas sat up in bed, taking a few seconds to adjust to the room's darkness.
Jimmy?
He remembered the woman mentioning her son, but something about her words had felt off. Pale moonlight streamed through the window. Lucas saw a young boy, around 10 years old, standing near the window, his back facing him. But when the boy turned to face Lucas, his heart skipped a beat. The boy's eyes were completely white, sunken, unblinking. They were the only thing Lucas could see. He asked,
Who are you?
But the boy just giggled and ran out of the room. Lucas couldn't fully grasp the horror of it yet, but unease crept into his chest. Panicked, he turned on the light and searched for his backpack. But as he looked around, he realized the room was not as it had been before. The surfaces were covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it had been abandoned for years. Terrified, he decided to leave immediately rather than wait until morning. As he turned to leave, he glanced back and they were there, standing in the doorway, staring at him with hollow eyes and sinister grins. A chilling, unnatural laughter echoed in his mind, paralyzing him with fear. Lucas bolted into the forest, but somehow he tripped and lost consciousness among the trees. When he woke up, he found himself in a hospital, his body aching and covered in wounds. A police officer approached him, asking about what had happened. Lucas recounted everything: the house, the strange family. The officer was silent for a moment before explaining that the house Lucas had described had been abandoned for years. No one had lived there for a long time. A family had once lived there, but their son had died after being attacked by a strange creature in the woods. Stricken with grief, the couple had also perished in that very house. Lucas struggled to accept what had happened. He realized that the family he had met were not living people. They were ghosts, their soulless white eyes and empty smiles haunting his memory. He now understood that he had survived a night of pure terror. The mysterious harmony from the ancient piano. Nee, a young woman in her early 20s, stepped into a small, dimly lit antique shop in a quiet neighborhood. The shop was cluttered with antiques, old books, worn furniture, dusty frames, and a few musical instruments scattered around. The air reeked of aged wood and forgotten memories. Nee walked past the counter where the shopkeeper stood. He stared at her with wide, unblinking eyes, as if he had been waiting. His face was gaunt, his skin pale. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was strange.
You found the piano. It's calling you. It will begin soon.
The word sent a chill down her spine, since she hadn't mentioned the piano. The atmosphere grew odd. She decided to look around briefly and leave quickly. Then, Nee's gaze landed on a piano, old and tucked away in the corner of the shop. Despite its age, its darkened wood seemed to exude a mysterious allure. She brushed her fingers lightly over the keys. The instrument's delicate beauty starkly contrasted its eerie presence, making it irresistible. She approached the counter to face the man again. This time, she noticed his hands were marked with faint, dark scars, as if burned or clawed repeatedly, the lines deep and jagged. She decided to take the piano and leave. The door chimed behind her, and she turned to see the shopkeeper standing at the window, staring at her unblinkingly as she walked away. From the moment she placed it in her room, strange things began to happen. Nee began to play the piano softly, trying to familiarize herself with its peculiar presence. The keys, though old, worked, but felt strange beneath her fingers. Suddenly, Nee stopped playing. The music lingered in the air for a moment before dissolving into faint whispers. She stood, heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. One night, after a restless sleep, she returned to the piano. Nye found a yellowed sheet of music tucked among the piano strings. Curious yet uneasy, she played it, only to discover the notes resonated in an inexplicable way. It felt as though the notes were alive, playing themselves before her fingers touched the keys. Unintentionally, Nee had begun to unlock the tragic history of the piano's previous owner. She continued to play, unable to understand why she couldn't stop. She heard a faint voice whispering in her ear, speaking an ancient language. The words seemed to echo in her mind, filling her thoughts. She stood up abruptly, thinking she was probably too tired, and decided to head to her room and sleep. Nee drifted into slumber after a tense day. She was no longer in her room, but found herself in a grand concert hall. The room was empty, except for a grand piano at its center, and dim light from antique chandeliers that looked decades old. As Nee approached the piano, she saw a tall, gaunt man seated at the keys. He wore an old black suit, but his sunken eyes and pale skin made him look like a wax statue. Nee called out,
Who's there?
The man slowly turned around. His gaze pierced through Nee, and his voice echoed like a distant whisper.
I've waited a long time.
Nee tried to step back, but it felt like her feet were pinned to the floor. The man glided closer, not moving his legs, as if floating on air. Then the man pointed toward an old table nearby. On it lay a dusty sheet of music titled Sonata of Eternity.
There's not much time left. Only this melody can save us, or drown us both.
Before Nee could respond, the space around her twisted into a black vortex, engulfing her. She woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, clutching a corner of her blanket. Everything around her was silent. The dream not only left a haunting impression, but also led Nee to crucial details in reality. Perhaps she had unwittingly opened a door, allowing the spirits and tragic memories of the composer to resurface. She could still recall the image of the man struggling amidst the shadows, his eyes filled with despair, as if begging her to uncover the truth. She stopped playing the piano. For days, she couldn't bring herself to touch the instrument. Night after night, Nye heard whispers growing louder and more persistent, making everything feel increasingly unbearable.
Help me. Free me from the curse.
These words seemed to come from the trapped soul of the composer, still bound to the piano through his music. Waking in despair, Nee approached the piano, slowly sitting down. She noticed a small, faint mirror appearing behind the instrument. Nee cautiously wiped the dust from the mirror. Beneath the grime, the figure of a man slowly emerged. The gaunt man, his deep, dark eyes locked onto hers. He said nothing, but his gaze was intense, almost pleading, as if trying to convey something. After staring into the mirror, Nee saw words gradually appear on the glass. The crooked writing seemed as though someone was etching it from the other side. You have only one chance." Then his bony, emaciated hand reached out from the mirror, grasping toward her, begging for salvation. Understand the final rhythm before you play.
Please, help me. Save me.
A weight pressed against her chest before everything returned to normal. Ni realized she had to complete the sonata. The only way to break the curse was to finish the music she had started. She was plunged into despair and fear as she realized the price of freeing him. If she didn't play the final sonata, the curse would claim her as well. As Ni studied the sheet music, every note seemed distorted, warning her. It revealed the words, When the piano begins to play, you must finish the music before the light in the mirror fades. If not, the door will close forever. Ni swallowed hard, feeling the weight pressing down on her shoulders. Time was running out. It could happen at any moment. In her darkest hour, Ni sat before the piano, determined to break the curse. The clock struck midnight. The room was ice cold, and the music filled the air like an oppressive weight. Ni's fingers trembled as she began to play the sonata, the final piece in the composer's symphony of sorrow. But as she neared the final notes, Ni realized the sheet music was incomplete. A note had been erased, forcing her to rely on her intuition to finish the piece. She couldn't stop now. Then the mirror behind the piano shattered. Startled, she paused for half a second but couldn't stop. The gaunt figure of the man seemed to crack with the mirror, his eyes filled with despair.
Save me. Be careful. If you fail, you will take my place.
He cried out, his voice laced with agony. Ni played the final note, placing all her faith in her intuition. In the last moment of the sonata, the piano emitted a piercing sound. A brilliant light burst from the mirror, and she felt the entire room being drawn into the vortex. The man's figure vanished, and the room suddenly fell silent. In the ensuing silence, the figure in the mirror was gone, leaving behind a whispered,
"Thank you."
The room felt lighter, as if both their burdens had been lifted. When the light faded, Ni found herself sitting in her quiet room, all the strings of her instrument broken, and the mirror shattered. Exhausted, Ni collapsed on the piano. Perhaps everything was truly over, and fortunately, she had completed it. But deep down, Ni didn't know if she would ever truly escape the haunting melodies that had once drowned her. Elevator and warning from the 9th aisle floor. Michael was invited for an interview at a building, hoping this would be a fresh opportunity for him. But before he stepped into the elevator, he encountered something strange. A strange man, seemingly a security guard, stopped him and sternly warned,
"Don't get off the elevator until it reaches the 9th floor."
He said in an odd tone, completely devoid of humor. There was something in his voice that sent chills down Michael's spine, as though he was hinting at something unseen.
"Don't do anything foolish,"
he added before walking away. Michael stood frozen for a moment, convincing himself it was just an absurd warning, yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. Michael stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the 9th floor. A soft chime echoed in the elevator, announcing each floor through the intercom, as if trying to ease his tension. When the elevator stopped at the 5th floor, Michael sensed something unusual. The sliding doors revealed a receptionist sitting at a desk. She looked at him and smiled warmly.
Good morning, Michael.
She greeted, leaving Michael stunned. What surprised him was the way she addressed him, as though she had known him for a long time, even though they had never met before. She spoke about his personal life, even recounting intimate details Michael had never shared with anyone. Leaning forward, she added,
We know everything.
and then smiled in a cryptic way. The doors closed before he could respond, and the elevator shuddered as it ascended. When the elevator reached the 11th floor, the doors opened, and an elderly woman stepped inside. She glanced at Michael, then turned back to stare at the elevator buttons. She said firmly.
I want to go to the second floor.
However, Michael objected, advising her against going there.
Nonsense.
Pressing the button for the second floor herself. When the elevator doors opened, it revealed what looked like a decayed, damp cave with slick walls oozing black water that seemed alive. The faint flickering lights only added to the eerie atmosphere. Michael stepped back, avoiding eye contact with the woman, but she was unfazed, stepping out as though this was where she belonged. Then she turned back, smiled, and asked,
Aren't you coming?
Michael panicked, frantically pressing the close button on the elevator. The woman slowly walked into the darkness, as if vanishing into thin air. But things did not end there. As the doors were about to close, a shadowy figure suddenly appeared, stopping the elevator doors with a bony hand. It was a man in a black suit with glowing red eyes.
Where are you rushing off to?
Michael stepped back, trying to maintain distance.
I'm not planning to get off on this floor. I'm heading to the 9th floor.
Then the man spoke about offering him a lucrative deal if he stayed. Michael frowned, his instincts warning him that this was far from good.
I don't need anything from you.
Oh, but I think you'll change your mind.
The man said, stepping closer.
Trade your eyes for eternal peace. You won't have to see any horrors again. A life free from pain, free from fear.
Michael froze as he stared into the man's cold gaze and realized that he had no eyes, just deep, empty black sockets. Michael felt a fog enveloping his mind, and before he realized it, he was stepping forward. But just as his hand was about to touch, a sound echoed from afar, snapping Michael back to reality.
No, I don't want that. I'll face it on my own.
The man's demeanor changed suddenly. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, sharp glare. He moved quickly toward Michael, arms outstretched, as if to pull him out of the elevator. The man grabbed his collar, yanking him off balance. Michael felt his foot slip off the edge of the elevator, stepping halfway into the dark void of the second floor. Michael grabbed the elevator railing and used all his strength to pull himself back. The man lost his balance and let go. Without wasting a second, Michael slammed the close door button. The elevator doors slowly shut, leaving the man standing in the darkness with a twisted smile.
You can't run forever, Michael.
The elevator continued to ascend. The buttons for the lower floors gradually disappeared from the control panel. He tried pressing a button, but the elevator did not respond. Then the TV screen switched to live footage of Michael, lying on the elevator floor, wearing a strange and unsettling smile. In panic, the elevator filled with a distorted version of the song Happy Birthday. When the elevator suddenly stopped at the 9th floor, the doors opened to reveal what seemed to be a normal reception area. Michael hesitated. The warmth of the room seemed to beckon him, but something about it felt too perfect. Then she stood there, pressing something that resembled a control panel, before vanishing in the blink of an eye. At that moment, he began to realize that he had stepped into an invisible labyrinth. Everything around him became hazy, and the scene seemed to unfold in an endless loop. The elevator descended to the first floor where he had entered. As he stepped out, he felt a brief sense of relief, only to witness someone else stepping into the elevator. As the doors closed, Michael instinctively warned the woman.
Don't step out until you reach the 9th floor.
The door shut, and the elevator began its ascent once again. Midnight flight. Due to his job, Lucas frequently traveled for business to meet clients. He was sitting alone at the airport, waiting for a late-night flight back to Sydney. The clock showed 1 a.m. The area where he was seated was almost deserted, except for a few scattered passengers. Lucas had his headphones on and was engrossed in his phone. The atmosphere felt strangely empty for such a usually busy airport. At that moment, a flight attendant, a woman in uniform with an eerie, unsettling smile, approached him and gently tapped him on the shoulder.
Sir,
Your flight is about to depart. I think you missed the announcement.
Lucas glanced around and realized he was the only one left in the waiting area. The elderly couple had already left, and there were no other passengers. His flight was scheduled for 1:30 a.m., but it was already 1:15 a.m. He quickly stood up and thanked her, surprised at how fast time had passed. Lucas got up and began following her. As they walked through the airport, he noticed something odd. She seemed to walk with an uneven gait. Then, he noticed a deep scar on her left leg, and her skin looked unusually pale. She led him onto the plane, and as he stepped inside, he was stunned to see that the entire plane was packed with passengers, none of whom he had noticed or seen in the waiting area. The atmosphere inside the plane was eerily silent, so much so that for a moment he thought no one was breathing. The passengers sat with their heads bowed, not talking, almost motionless. After boarding, she leaned close and whispered in his ear.
Please take your seat, sir.
If he had been alone, he might have screamed. The cold, chilling breath in her whisper made his ears feel frozen. Lucas went to his seat by the window. As he sat down, he noticed a thin man in formal attire seated next to him, but there was something off about his face. Lucas felt the plane was unusually cold, and soon, a foul stench began to permeate the air around him. Lucas fastened his seatbelt and waited for the plane to take off, but none of the other passengers moved or changed their behavior. They all remained silent and expressionless. He told the man next to him,
It's so cold in here.
The man didn't reply. He just sat there with his head bowed. Lucas thought maybe he was asleep or didn't want to talk. Then all the lights began flickering. Suddenly, the emergency alarm blared, and the plane started shaking violently. Lightning flashed across the sky outside. A violent jolt caused luggage to fall from the overhead compartments. He screamed, but the man next to him and everyone else showed no signs of panic. They all sat like statues, seemingly indifferent to what was happening. In a panic, Lucas tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but it was stuck. Desperate, he shouted for help. Then, he turned to the man next to him, saying,
Excuse me, please wake up. This plane is going to crash. Please, we need to do something, or we're all going to die.
As Lucas struggled, the man next to him slowly looked up. His face was horrifying, with one side severely burned and scarred. He smiled, a chilling, terrifying grin, and said,
They're all dead.
The other passengers now revealed grotesque faces. A spine-chilling, sinister laughter erupted from all of them. They began laughing in unison, a shrill, terrifying sound. Please let me off, he begged. At that moment, his seatbelt came undone, and he ran toward the exit to escape. But the flight attendant suddenly appeared, blocking his path. Her face was now unrecognizable, her body covered in wounds, smeared with blood, and she had a wide, menacing grin. He shoved the flight attendant aside and ran toward the cockpit, hoping to find the pilots. When he opened the door, he was met with a horrifying sight. Both pilots were gone, and everything inside was engulfed in flames. His vision began to blur. His head throbbed, and the faint sound of devilish laughter echoed in his ears.
Sir, are you okay?
The voice startled Lucas awake. It was a security guard at the airport, leaning down to check on him. He slowly sat up, his body trembling, and looked around. He was no longer on the plane. Instead, Lucas was lying next to the charred wreckage of what looked like an old airplane. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and something worse. The guard told him that this area was restricted.
That plane had been struck by lightning a week ago, and everyone on board, including the flight attendants and pilots, had perished.
Shocked, Lucas stammered that he had been on that plane. He looked at the plane, horrified by what he had just experienced. He knew he had narrowly escaped the dark fate that had befallen the passengers of that ill-fated flight. The deadly neighbor. My family and I moved into a house in the suburbs. and the neighbors seemed friendly until I met Mara. She happened to be the neighbor next door, and my mom quickly befriended her. At first, she seemed kind and friendly, often visiting my mom for coffee chats, but there was something unsettling about her. One afternoon, Mara visited us. She and my mom were chatting on the balcony, and I don't know why I was there. Probably out of boredom, but I sat with them. Before my mom stood up to get a cake she had just baked, I was still sitting at the table with Mara, and that's when my life might have changed forever. Mara was a ghostly-looking woman, thin with long black hair and unnaturally large yellow eyes. Her eyes were so unnatural that maintaining eye contact for more than 3 seconds felt impossible. We sat in silence until she suddenly turned toward me, a creepy smile spreading across her face. She began tilting her head slowly from side to side, almost like a puppet, and then said, "Are you ready to go now, little one?" I froze in place. Her voice had changed significantly. There was something darker about it. She began pulling out a black rose from her purse, an odd-looking flower, and held it out toward me. It was the first time I'd ever seen a black rose, and I started sweating from fear. Before I could react, my mom returned with the tray of cake, and Mara suddenly reverted to normal, as if someone flipped a switch. She quietly placed the black rose back into her purse, her face expressionless, and my mom didn't notice. I left the balcony, trying to dismiss the encounter, but something inside me knew that she was no ordinary neighbor. At night, my room was on the ground floor, and my window was high up. To be honest, I was never an easily frightened kid, but that night, I didn't know why, a strange feeling flooded my mind. I kept tossing and turning, nervously checking and peeking out the window every 5 minutes. Finally, as I began to drift off, I decided to look out the window one last time to ease my mind. But to my horror, Mara was standing at my window, the faint moonlight illuminating her smudged, grinning lips, just like the eerie smile I had seen on her face earlier that afternoon. I began walking toward the door with trembling legs, sweat pouring down like rain. As I kept moving, Mara's sinister yellow eyes followed me in slow, puppet-like motions. I reached for the doorknob, but then she raised the black rose again and muttered those eerie words. "I hope you're ready now." I screamed, "Please leave me alone." The moment I said that, her smile disappeared, replaced by an angry scowl as she shook her head side to side in disapproval. Then the worst happened. Mara was trying to get inside. She gripped the window frame and began slamming herself against it with both hands. Horrified, I watched as the window slid open, and she began pushing her head through the gap. Mara's body twisted unnaturally, like a puppet manipulated by invisible strings. Panicking, I grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. It was stuck. I couldn't open the door. She was almost inside. I heard her laughter, a sound that sent terror coursing through my veins. "You will come with me. You will be my last one." Suddenly, the door opened, and I bolted out of the room, screaming for my dad. He was a light sleeper, and when I burst into his room, he jumped out of bed in a panic. All I could say was, "Mara, the window." You know how people vanish when someone else comes? The same happened to me. I caught a glimpse of Mara leaving. I saw her in the distance, disappearing into the shadows beyond a house as the faint glow of lights passed over her. But my dad didn't see her. He checked the window, but Mara was gone. The next morning, I woke up to see police cars parked outside Mara's house. They were murmuring that the police had found something horrific inside her home. I was grateful to be alive. They had found innocent lives, 4 children's bodies buried in her backyard. With each body, she had buried a black rose, as if part of some dark ritual. And I might have been the last one. To this day, I wake up at night drenched in sweat, terrified that Mara is standing near my bed, tilting her head to the left with that same malicious smile, whispering, "You will come with me." The madness of the masked man. Susan had a terrifying experience a few years ago. It all began on a Tuesday night. Susan was enjoying a rare evening alone when her husband, Jeff, called to let her know he was stuck in traffic and would stay at a motel overnight. He promised to call her when he got home. Susan sighed and returned to her book. She wasn't afraid of being alone at night as she was used to it, but as time passed, she began feeling increasingly bored and restless. She had completed all the chores and errands, leaving her with nothing else to do but sit in the room. Susan decided to take a long, hot bath to relax that evening. The past few weeks had been stressful, and she looked forward to a moment of peace and quiet to wash away the tension. Suddenly, there was a faint knocking sound from downstairs. It was weak, like a distant noise. She frowned, uncertain. Maybe it was nothing, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. She stepped out of the bathroom and descended the stairs, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The living room appeared calm, but something felt off. Then she felt a draft. The cold night air blew in through the window. Susan froze, hurrying to close it, but before she could, a shadow appeared on the other side. A man wearing a mask and a black hoodie stared directly at her, his hands on his hips as if daring her to approach.
Come outside, Susan.
Panicking, she slammed the window shut, locked it tightly, and ran to escape. Seconds later, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. He had broken the window to get inside. The man, wielding a knife, stepped through the window, his mask still on and hoodie pulled tight. His movements were slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Susan frantically locked the living room door and rushed upstairs to the second floor. He was right behind her, chasing leisurely.
Don't run like that, girl. I'll catch you soon enough.
Susan stumbled through the hallway, entering the master bedroom. Her breathing was shallow as she strained to hear any sound from downstairs. Susan stepped into a small, rarely used room on the second floor. But one thing she was certain of, he wouldn't find it. It was a hidden space in the attic, known only to her and her husband. She was sure no one from the outside would see her as Susan pressed herself against the wall. A voice echoed just outside the attic door.
Oh, Susan, I know you're here.
A voice strangely familiar. Susan could hear his creaking footsteps getting closer. A terrifying silence filled the air. In a flash, he appeared right in front of her. The mask had now slipped slightly. Her body turned cold as she suddenly recognized the familiar eyes staring back at her. Susan whispered,
Jeff?
She backed away in fear. The man smiled, gripping the knife tightly.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us.
Perhaps from excitement, the mask slid partially off his face, and what she saw made the realization even more horrifying. It was Susan's husband, standing right in front of her. His knife rose as he laughed.
What are you doing, Jeff? What's wrong with you?
He only laughed louder and stepped forward, shoving Susan against the wall. His eyes were something she had never seen before, the eyes of a true madman. At that moment, she knew Jeff had completely lost control.
Don't worry, Susan. I'm doing this for us,
he said, pulling a syringe out of his pocket while holding the knife in his other hand. He gripped Susan's hand and held the syringe, slowly and mockingly bringing it toward her neck.
It'll be gentle, my love.
Susan screamed in terror and kicked him in the shin, causing him to stumble and shatter the syringe. She fled from the attic, but he quickly chased after her, shouting angrily. As he raised the knife above her, a loud noise erupted. Susan turned to see he had tripped down the stairs. Susan didn't stop running until she reached the neighbor's house and called the police. Her husband, Jeff, was finally apprehended and committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with severe delusions and paranoia, which had driven him to aggression and irrationality. Since then, Susan has been almost constantly afraid of being alone at night. Her fear is so overwhelming that she now suffers from agoraphobia and panic attacks whenever she's alone at home. At times, she needs medication to calm herself. Horror menu at fast food store. Alex was working the third shift at a local Wendy's to pay for his tuition. The job was nothing special, just the occasional late-night customer, making things a little more interesting. That night, he spent most of his shift sweeping and wiping down counters. Just as he thought he was going to die of boredom, a car pulled up to the drive-through speaker. Alex set down his rag, put on his headset, and said,
Welcome to Wendy's. What can I get for you?
The car pulled up to the pickup window, and the order was unusually large, 50 chicken nuggets and 10 double cheeseburgers. Alex entered the order into the computer, feeling sorry for his coworker, Brad, who was the only cook on shift. Brad would have to make all of that food by himself. Alex asked if he wanted anything else, but the man remained silent and simply drove up to the window. A pickup truck. The man's vehicle was white, coated in a thick layer of grime on the windshield and windows, with patches of rust and dents. As the driver's window rolled down, Alex finally saw him. The man was unsettling. He had pale, sunken eyes with dark purple circles underneath. He was sweating and looked restless. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Strange scars ran down his arms, as if something had gnawed on his limbs. Alex tried not to stare and opened the window. A horrific stench wafted out from the truck, a smell like a rotting swamp. The man said nothing. He simply handed Alex a crumpled $50 bill. Alex took the money, trying to remain calm despite the man's scarred arms and the truck's overwhelming stench. One thing Alex had learned working in fast food was to avoid conflict at all costs. He handed the man his change and directed him to the designated waiting spot for large orders. Alex told him he'd bring the food out when it was ready, but the man just stared at him with those hollow eyes. Then, the man muttered something repeatedly. Sandy is so hungry. Alex quickly told him the food would be ready soon and shut the window. But the man didn't move. He didn't park where Alex had directed him. Alex waited for Brad to start passing the food through the window. But after 5 minutes, Brad had only prepared 20 nuggets and 2 burgers. After a few minutes of waiting, he started knocking on the window, demanding his food. When Alex opened the window to check, the man insisted, Sandy won't wait any longer. Alex could only nod, promising to hurry before quickly shutting the window. Less than 2 minutes passed before he knocked again. This time, he reached out, grabbed Alex by the collar, and snarled,
Sandy won't wait anymore. Do you want me to feed you to her?
Panicked, Alex shoved him away and demanded he leave. The man growled, jumped into his truck, and sped off into the night. About half an hour passed with no customers, so Alex and Brad sat in the kitchen, chatting. Suddenly, in the middle of their conversation, the power in the store cut out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. Alex and Brad froze, turning toward the noise. He had come back. He stood at the window, no longer in his truck, this time clutching a large sack against his chest. His pale lips curled into a sickening smile. Then, to Alex's horror, he pushed open the window.
Sandy needs to eat.
Brad lunged toward the window in rage. The man opened the sack and dumped its contents into the store. Something heavy and wet hit the floor with a sickening sound. Alex squinted, trying to make sense of it. The horrific sound sent chills down Alex's spine. He pulled his phone from his pocket and turned on the flashlight. What he saw would haunt him forever. It was an alligator. It lunged forward and clamped its jaws around Brad's ankle. Brad screamed in agony. The lunatic at the window giggled. "Sandy's hungry. Sandy's hungry," he repeated over and over. Alex grabbed a cast iron pan and swung it with all his strength at the alligator. It screeched and backed off for a moment. In a frenzy, Alex yanked Brad into the kitchen and slammed the door shut behind them. He dialed 911 as they waited in terror, the sound of claws scraping against the floor and the lunatic's distorted mumblings echoing outside. After 10 agonizing minutes, the police arrived and arrested the man. Yet he still wore that deranged, inexplicable grin. Animal control arrived a few minutes later, sedated the alligator, and transported it to a wildlife sanctuary. The Echo of the Hunter. It was an afternoon. Leo had been restless all day, so he decided to take Max for a walk to a nearby field. It was spacious, airy, and peaceful. However, as they ventured deeper into the field, Leo started hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like someone groaning, but he ignored it. Shortly after, a figure emerged from the trees. A man wearing a long black coat. Leo wondered who would wear a long coat in such hot weather. For some reason, he had a bad feeling. He quickly hid behind a tree, hoping the man hadn't seen him. He crouched down and commanded his dog to stay quiet. Thankfully, Max was always an obedient pup. The man lingered for a moment, but eventually walked away. A few minutes later, Leo could no longer hear his footsteps. He thought he was safe, but just as he started to leave with his dog, Leo heard that eerie groaning sound again behind him. At first, Leo hesitated, but he slowly turned around to see what was happening. He wished no one would ever have to experience something like this, because what he saw at that moment would become the worst nightmare of his life. He was there, standing still, staring at Leo. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him was a woman. Her clothes were torn and stained with something dark, something Leo didn't want to think about. She was holding a knife. Her eerie smile twisted in a way that made her look completely insane.
Max, run!
Leo turned and sprinted away. He was halfway through the field when, in his frantic escape, he tripped and fell to the ground. Pain shot through his knee as he hit the ground and skidded forward. The woman's laughter echoed behind him. As he tried to get up, he realized his foot had been impaled by a shard of glass from a broken beer bottle. But there was no time. He summoned all his strength and yanked it out. It was difficult to stand and run. Leo struggled to crawl forward, knowing they had surely seen him and would catch up in no time. The woman got closer.
Leave me alone,
he screamed at them, hoping someone would hear his cries for help. But there was no one around. Max, Leo's dog, stood in front of him and began growling at the woman. Just as she moved to strike, Max lunged and sank his teeth into her leg, making her scream in agony. In retaliation, she threw his dog to the ground, injuring it severely. An uncontrollable rage surged within Leo. He got up and saw that she was wounded at the hip, so he lunged at her, causing her immense pain. But before Leo could catch his breath, a sharp pain shot through his spine. As Leo collapsed to the ground, he saw the man standing behind him. The man had stabbed him, making Leo fall, gasping for air as the world spun around him. Leo thought he was about to die, and in those final moments before closing his eyes, a gunshot rang out beside him. It was Leo's neighbor. He was holding a hunting rifle and had shot the man in the hand, making him scream in pain. Later, the neighbor told Leo that he had been out hunting and, upon reaching the field, had hurt him. His hunting dogs had charged at the man and bitten him. The neighbor then rushed to help Leo stand up, but Leo insisted that he help his dog first instead of him. Then he finally passed out. When Leo woke up, he was in the hospital with his neighbor standing beside him. He told Leo that his dog had been taken to the vet, and had miraculously survived. The man who attacked Leo was arrested and sent to a psychiatric hospital, but the woman didn't survive due to excessive blood loss. It turned out that they were dangerous criminals who had escaped from the mental institution together. Later, my neighbor lost his right to own firearms because he had shot someone, but he didn't care. He said he had done the right thing to save lives. Leo also felt incredibly lucky to be alive. Being hunted by a murderer. Becoming a horror writer seemed like a terrifying thing, and I won't lie to you about that. Especially in the beginning, when I first started writing. I would find inspiration by writing at 3, 4, or 5 in the morning. I couldn't help but close all the closet doors or bathroom doors because I was afraid of my own stories. Over time, I started writing about real-life cases on a YouTube channel. As I researched and studied real-life cases, I became increasingly immersed in horrific and unbelievable crimes as I dug deeper into the minds of the killers. The fear grew, but it didn't last long. This used to happen to me until I had an experience like the ones I had written about, which made me understand the real horror that all the victims must have endured. As usual, that day, I took a can of apple soda from the fridge, took a sip absent-mindedly, but that day I felt restless. There was a change in the air, a sense that something was off. I went back to my room. What I didn't know at the time, and wouldn't have realized if I hadn't checked the camera, was that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me through the window, but I brushed it off, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was a call from my girlfriend. I picked up and told her I'd see her tomorrow. But something was off. Even as I spoke to her, my eyes kept drifting toward the window. It's just the darkness, I told myself. I hung up, trying to focus on my work again. And then, without warning, the lights flickered and went out. Power outages in this old building weren't unusual, but tonight, it felt different. I stood up from my desk and went down to the basement to check the fuse box. I fumbled around for a flashlight, but it seemed to have disappeared. The house had become eerily silent as I slowly descended the stairs. I made my way slowly down to the fuse box, which was only a few steps away, but it felt miles away as I tried not to trip over the cluttered floor in the dark. When I reached it, I reached out and found the light switch had come back on, and I breathed a sigh of relief. I started walking back toward the stairs with a little more ease. Then suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the fuse box behind me, so I turned around and what I saw, I couldn't believe. A figure was in my house, the silhouette of a man. He wore a strange, eerie mask and was dressed head to toe in black. In an instant, the basement went completely dark again. I couldn't see anything, and I became desperate, so I ran as fast as I could up the stairs. But in my attempt to hurry, I slipped and fell back down the stairs, landing in the basement with the intruder. My leg throbbed with pain. For a moment, I couldn't get up because of the excruciating pain and fear. So, I crawled backward and leaned against the wall to hide in the only light source in the basement, a small beam coming from a tiny window. I tried to stay silent, not making a single sound. His footsteps were right beside me, getting closer and closer. Step by step, he was getting closer, and I could feel everything. Then the footsteps stopped beside me. I didn't hear any more footsteps. Instead, I heard his breathing. His breath sounded heavy, perhaps because he couldn't get much air through the large mask he was wearing. I thought about fighting him, but I won't lie, I was truly terrified. The footsteps began to move away. He was searching for me. I took advantage of the moment when he moved farther away and started crawling up the stairs very slowly. I didn't realize that the basement key was still in my pocket, but due to the friction, it slipped out of my pants pocket. By then, it was too late. He ran towards me, grabbed my leg, and started pulling me back. "You want real horror, don't you?" He mocked and threatened. "You want to write about it, but now you'll have to live with it." I grabbed the door in desperation and struggled with all my might. Then I kicked him a few times until he let go and fell to the ground. When he fell to the ground, he didn't try to climb back up due to the thread of light from the outside shining on his mask. He just stood still, as if staring at me. I locked the door and called the police. I was frozen in shock when I learned the truth about him. When the police interrogated him, he confessed that he was a fan of mine. He believed that by becoming a part of my horror stories, he would be remembered forever. He wanted to become a legend in the stories I wrote. The mask he wore was to see himself as a character in the story. But that was only part of the truth. The man was a dangerous killer on the run. Since that day, every time I write a horror story, I think of him in fear and in the terrifying moment when I thought I wouldn't escape that situation, even for just a few seconds. But fortunately, I made it out alive. The sinister plan of the imposter. Leo, a 13-year-old boy, was sent to stay with his Uncle Donnie in a remote, isolated town for a few weeks, while his mother resolved some personal matters. He never imagined this visit would turn into a nightmare. When Leo first arrived, Uncle Danny was a warm and friendly man, welcoming him with open arms. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. The house was old but cozy. However, as time passed, Leo began noticing strange things. Uncle Danny's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He would spend hours staring at the walls, mumbling to himself, and engaging in peculiar habits. One evening, Leo spotted his uncle in the yard with a net and a glass jar, seemingly catching something peculiar. Then, Uncle Danny brought it to the backyard balcony. What Leo saw next left him frozen in disbelief. Leo saw his uncle holding a larva. To his horror, Uncle Danny calmly placed it into his mouth, swallowing it without any sign of disgust. Leo tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just an eccentricity, but the strangeness grew. Uncle Danny's cooking became odd. Once delicious meals now looked disturbing, sometimes containing unrecognizable ingredients. One night, Leo started suspecting something far worse was happening. He called his mother, explaining what he had witnessed, but she didn't believe him at first. He needed evidence. Leo's unease grew as Uncle Danny became increasingly distant and frightening. At night, Leo began hearing strange noises coming from his uncle's room. Uncle Danny even avoided eye contact, something he never did before. His smiles became forced and unsettling. One afternoon, Leo snuck into the kitchen to take pictures and videos of his uncle, preparing another strange meal. The photo shocked him. From this angle, his uncle looked unrecognizable, his features distorted. Terrified, Leo sent the photo to his mother. Her initial skepticism turned into horror. She called him back. "Leo, you need to stay calm. Just wait there. I'll come get you," she reassured him, though Leo could hear the anxiety in her voice. As time passed, Leo began to feel an overwhelming pressure. He couldn't just wait. He had to do something before it was too late. He remembered his mother mentioning Uncle Danny's insomnia. Recalling the bottle of sleeping pills in the bathroom, Leo quietly took it and slipped it into his pocket as he tiptoed into the kitchen. Uncle Danny was there, his back turned to Leo as he prepared something with a foul, frightening smell. Leo quickly crushed the pills and mixed them into the food. That night, Uncle Danny ate the food without suspicion, but he quickly fell into a deep sleep. Leo sat in his room, waiting. The storm outside raged on, and the world beyond seemed to be closing in on him. His mother called again, telling him that a light snowstorm was sweeping through the area, but she would try to get there as soon as possible. Time was running out. Hours passed. Leo couldn't take it anymore. He had to ensure his mother would arrive. He went downstairs, and that's when he saw him again. Uncle Donnie approached Leo in a frightening manner, but Leo smiled, acting as though nothing was wrong. Leo told him his mother was coming to visit, and that she said she was very hungry. He asked if Uncle Danny could help him prepare a meal for her. Leo breathed a sigh of relief when his uncle froze for a moment before smiling and agreeing. It felt like a narrow escape. Leo needed to come up with more ways to stall for time until his mother arrived. The upcoming moments would be a living nightmare. After a while, Uncle Danny went to the back of the house, while the snow outside continued to fall heavily. The ticking of the old clock seemed louder in the silence. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. It was a man standing on the doorstep, his face pale and cold. He introduced himself as being from the town hospital, saying that Uncle Danny hadn't shown up for his volunteer shifts in days and hadn't been heard from. Leo didn't know how to respond, unsure if his suspicions were correct, so he simply said Uncle Danny was out. The man left, but Leo's unease continued to grow. Later, while Uncle Danny was away, Leo didn't know what to do, so he began exploring the house and discovered secrets in the basement. When he opened the basement door, the room was cluttered with old boxes and furniture. He found jars filled with strange, wriggling creatures, along with the rancid stench of rotting food. Among the mess, Leo found an old photo of two people, a woman and a man. The man looked strikingly like Uncle Danny, only older and slightly different. The snowstorm worsened. The lights flickered, and eventually, the house was plunged into darkness. Leo used the dim glow of his phone flashlight and slowly crept up the stairs. He wandered toward the living room aimlessly. Then suddenly, a creaking sound came from somewhere in the house. In the living room, through the faint light streaming in from outside, Leo saw a figure sitting on a chair, facing the wall. It was a familiar silhouette. The silence in the room was stifling. Without warning, Uncle Danny suddenly turned around, his wild, vacant eyes glaring at Leo. "You think I didn't know, Leo?" Leo froze, fear washing over him. His heart pounded as if it wanted to escape his chest. He swallowed hard, trying to stay calm, but his hands began trembling. Donnie took a step closer, leaning in, his voice low and tense. "You ate the cake in my fridge, didn't you?" Leo froze, his eyes wide, muttering a vague apology and offering an excuse to deflect suspicion. In truth, he didn't even know the cake existed. Moments later, the lights came back on, and Leo tried to think of a way to stall until his mother arrived. In his anxiety, he recalled Uncle Danny once mentioning a small cellar under the kitchen where he kept special items. He asked his uncle to retrieve an item for him, claiming he was afraid of the dark and confined spaces. Donnie paused, staring at Leo with a puzzled expression. "All right, Leo," he said, his voice slow, as though contemplating something. Then he uttered a chilling sentence. "One last time, I'll indulge you." Danny bent down, yanking the cellar door open. The hinges screeched loudly in the eerie silence as he squinted into the darkness below. The cellar was pitch black, and a musty odor wafted out, forcing Leo to step back to steady himself. As Danny was halfway into the cellar, Leo suddenly heard him let out a cold, menacing chuckle. Then he stopped, looked up at Leo and said, "You know, Leo, there's so much more to discover down here. Would you like to come in?" Leo shuddered, fear rising in his throat. But he managed to keep his composure and immediately declined. Donnie laughed loudly, then continued descending into the cellar. Once he was completely out of sight, Leo realized he had only one chance. But at that moment, Donnie suddenly looked up, his eyes gleaming like a predator spotting prey, shouting to ask what Leo was doing. Leo didn't answer, quickly stepping forward, grabbing the cellar door and slamming it shut with all his strength. Donnie roared from below, his screams a mix of rage and panic. He hurriedly slid the latch to lock the cellar door. From below, Donnie's pounding on the door echoed fiercely. When the police and his mother arrived, Donnie was pulled out of the cellar in a completely unhinged state. He screamed and repeated nonsensical words about the darkness. Leo's mother couldn't believe her eyes, as they had initially believed this man was Uncle Danny. But now, the truth was undeniable. He was a psychiatric patient. During one of Uncle Danny's volunteer shifts at the hospital where the man was being treated, he had met Danny and felt a strange connection. He became increasingly obsessed with Uncle Danny's life. When Danny mentioned Leo's upcoming visit, he decided it would be fun to experience that life, taking Danny's place. His mother held him tightly after everything they had just learned. It was over, but the pain of the loss and the truth about his late uncle would haunt Leo in sleepless nights to come. Invisible ownership. Lena grew up in a strict family that didn't believe in ghosts, but was absolutely certain about demons. But her mother was different. She was indifferent to faith and struggled with mental health issues. One night, Lena had a terrifyingly vivid nightmare that she remembers in detail to this day. Lena was lying in bed when her mother burst into her room, screaming in rage. She grabbed Lena's wrist and shook her violently. Lena woke up drenched in sweat, her body stiff with fear. But before she could shake off the nightmare, it happened again, except this time, she wasn't asleep. The door swung open, and there she was, just like in Lena's nightmare. The same furious expression, the same inexplicable anger, the same words. It was as if the dream had been a prophecy. Lena barely managed to push her away, screaming for her to stop. And then, just as suddenly as she had entered, her mother walked away. The next morning, when Lena confronted her, her mother remembered nothing. She looked confused, even slightly hurt. Lena was too shocked and told herself it was just a coincidence, but deep down, she wondered if it was something much worse. A few weeks later, Lena heard her mother screaming from the backyard. It was a strange sound, not a scream of panic or even distress, but of excitement. She rushed outside and froze at what she saw. Her mother stood in the yard, grinning, holding a snake in her bare hands. But the worst part? She had been terrified of snakes her whole life. She couldn't even look at them on TV without recoiling. Yet, there she was, clutching the snake like it was a toy.
Come here, take it.
Mom, what the hell is going on?
But her mother's eyes didn't seem to register her words. She just smiled and tilted her head in an eerie way. Lena turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind her. Peeking through the window, she saw her mother still standing there, holding the snake like an offering, before finally placing it down and walking inside as if nothing had happened. That winter, her church hosted an overnight retreat, a chance for Lena to escape her chaotic home life. She felt relieved to go. Her mother dropped her off, completely lucid, even kissing her forehead before driving away. Around 4:30 a.m., as everyone lay deep in sleep, a loud knocking echoed through the chapel. Everyone sat up, glancing at each other. The knocking moved around the building in an unimaginable way, sometimes seeming to come from multiple directions at once, rhythmic and eerie. No one knew where it was coming from. The pastor, the only one with the key, was asleep in his office and hadn't heard anything. Lena ran to wake him up. As soon as he stepped into the chapel, the knocking stopped. He opened the front door and actually staggered back in fear. Standing there, barefoot in the freezing cold, clothes disheveled, hair drenched in sweat, it was Lena's mother. Her lips moved, but Lena couldn't hear what she was saying. She didn't acknowledge the pastor. Her eyes locked onto Lena immediately. A slow, unsettling smile spread across her face as she stepped toward her. The pastor grabbed her wrist.
Stay here.
But Lena felt utterly powerless, as if she had no choice but to go with her mother. She climbed into the car, afraid that her mother would do something, but she didn't. The drive home was silent. She said nothing, no explanation, no response when Lena asked why she had come. When they reached home, she stopped at the door and simply stared at Lena, standing silently as Lena walked into her room. Lena shut the door, locked it, and lay awake for hours, listening. But her mother's behavior only grew stranger. The next morning, her mother acted completely normal standing in the kitchen, happily making breakfast, as if the strange events of the night before had never happened. No one else at the church remembered it. Or worse, they refused to talk about it. That was how people treated her mother back then. Now, her mother was gone, but Lena would never forget. The experience lingered, and the uncertainty of what she had witnessed haunted her long after. For better or worse, she no longer knew if she believed in demons or the supernatural, but Lena couldn't explain what had happened. Reflection in the mirror. This happened when Mocha was in high school. Her school was an old building, with some parts nearly falling apart. The school had 3 main restrooms that were well maintained, but the last one was different. It was isolated from the other buildings. The floor was always filthy, and out of 6 stalls, only 3 had doors, which were barely functional. One day, Mocha found herself in a desperate situation, needing to use the restroom in the middle of class. Unfortunately, the closest option was that disgusting restroom. Since it was the nearest, and she didn't want to test her luck holding it in, she had no choice but to go inside. She rushed toward the old restroom. As soon as she stepped inside, a horrible stench filled her nose, the most disgusting smell she had ever encountered. Mocha hurried into the last stall, which was much cleaner than the others, and tried her best to avoid touching the filthy floor. Afterward, Mocha went to the sink to wash her hands. The restroom was eerily silent, with only the sound of running water. Just then, she heard a faint knocking. Confused, she slowly turned off the faucet. Silence. For a moment, she thought she was imagining things, until the sound came again. She glanced at the mirror, but couldn't see anything. The surface was covered in grime. So Mocha grabbed a tissue and began wiping the mirror. Through the fading haze, she saw something moving, and then she finally saw it. Something pale, something bony. She didn't want to believe her eyes, but there it was, a hand reaching out from one of the stalls, tapping on the door. However, when Mocha quickly turned around, the fingers had vanished. Her heart pounded, but she convinced herself it was just her imagination. But that was when the nightmare began. When Mocha looked into the mirror, she was horrified, unable to believe what she was seeing. In the mirror, her reflection was smiling back at her. But it wasn't just an ordinary smile, it was distorted, grotesque. Mocha's real face was frozen in fear, lips pressed tight. But in the mirror, that was not her. And then, Mocha heard the knocking again. To her horror, she saw her reflection knocking on the mirror, trying to grab her attention, beckoning her with the other hand. It whispered, a faint sound, as if it was coming from inside her head. Come closer. At that moment, her feet felt glued to the ground. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Then, from the corner of her eye, the stall door creaked open, inch by inch, something oozing out from within. Mocha couldn't breathe. The air in the restroom turned freezing cold. Then, a long skeletal hand emerged. Its claw-like fingers scraped against the grimy tiles, leaving deep scratches. But it didn't stop there. Behind her, another sound a leg, a twisted limb. Its head snapped to the side like a broken doll, smiling as it crept toward her. And in the mirror, Her reflection reached out, grabbing her wrist. Its sharp nails dug into her skin, pulling her toward the glass. Mocha screamed, struggling to break free from its icy grip. Overwhelmed with fear, her vision blurred. Staggering backward, she grabbed a soap dispenser and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered into countless shards, the sharp sound snapping her back to reality. She screamed. The stall door burst open. Mocha ran, stumbling, crashing onto the hallway floor. In that moment, she felt something brush against her hair from behind. In sheer panic, she ran without looking back. Back in class, Mocha tried to tell her friends about her horrifying experience, but they dismissed her, saying she was imagining things. From that day forward, no one believed her. She never returned to that restroom again, terrified of what she had seen. The memory of that day haunted her endlessly. She became paranoid about mirrors, always doubting their reflections, unable to look at them for too long, always needing to cover them up. Even to this day, Mocha does not want to know what she truly saw, but for the rest of her life, she will never forget what stared back at her from the mirror. From that day on, she developed a deep, unshakable fear of mirrors. Escape your pursuer at Dunkin' Donuts. Isa worked the night shift at her uncle's Dunkin' Donuts, a small, quiet spot off a lonely highway, struggling with boredom as a violent storm raged outside. Her phone battery died, flickering before finally shutting off. With a sigh, she plugged it into the charger. The empty Dunkin' Donuts felt eerily quiet. Feeling sleepiness creeping in from the stillness of the night shift, Isa got up and headed to the back to make herself a cup of coffee. Trying to stay alert, Isa sat at the corner table, sipping her coffee. The sound of the storm seemed to press in from all directions, making her feel unusually uneasy in the empty store. Just as she took another sip, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. The bell above the door rang, signaling someone had entered. Isa froze. She wasn't expecting anyone, especially during this storm. Blinking, she slowly moved toward the counter, the only light coming from a nearby candle. As Isa lifted the candle, the pale face of a woman emerged from the shadows. Her hair was disheveled, her pants torn in multiple places, and her shirt dotted with what looked like dried blood. Isa, horrified, exclaimed,
Oh my God, you scared me. What happened to you? Are you okay?
The woman's eyes were wide with fear, an expression haunted and desperate.
Please.
She gasped.
You have to help me. He's coming. If we don't move fast, he'll kill me.
Before Isa could respond, headlights swept across the window. A blue pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. The woman grabbed Isa's arm with surprising strength for someone so frail.
We need to hide. Now.
Isa led her to the storage room and locked the door. Chaos ensued as the front door of the store opened again, this time revealing a man in his 40s with cold, sharp eyes. Isa forced a smile, trying to stay calm and keep him from suspecting anything.
Good evening. Can I get you something?
The man didn't answer immediately, his eyes darting toward the back room, where the door was slightly ajar.
I'm looking for someone. A woman. She came in here, didn't she?
Isa shook her head and said it was just her there. Isa was on high alert. The man kept his hand fidgeting in his jacket pocket, as if ready to pull something out at any moment. He seemed unconvinced and stepped closer to the counter, his cold, calculating eyes fixed on her.
Are you sure?
Things felt wrong. Before Isa could respond, the backroom door burst open. The woman dashed out, holding a fire extinguisher.
Run!
She shouted as she sprayed water into his face, then unleashed a torrent of foam, forcing the man to stagger back, momentarily blinded. They grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter and bolted out the back door into the raging storm, disappearing into the pitch-black night. Freezing, They ran toward the woods. The man wasn't far behind, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he shouted threats. Finally, they found an abandoned wooden cabin, dilapidated and isolated, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. They immediately began barricading the door with an old table.
What now?
Isa whispered. The woman pulled out a small knife from her pocket and told Isa that, if necessary, they would face him. She had been running from him for weeks and decided it was time to stop hiding. He arrived and began pounding on the door, trying to force his way in. Isa and the woman exchanged a look, bracing for whatever would happen next. He burst through the door. The woman charged at him, knocking him off balance. Isa, trembling but determined, swung the baseball bat hard at his head. He collapsed to the floor, dazed. The woman quickly grabbed a rope from the cabin and tied the man up while Isa used his phone to call the police. When the police arrived, they uncovered horrifying evidence in his truck, tools for murder and belongings from previous victims, women he had kidnapped and tortured. As the storm began to dissipate, it was finally over. They turned to each other and smiled. Warning in the mirror. The stadium erupted with energy, filled with thousands of cheering, shouting, and clapping fans. It was Nana's first time attending a live football match with her dad, and she was beyond excited watching the game, enjoying popcorn, even though she didn't fully understand the match. Nana finished a large cup of Pepsi and started feeling a tingling sensation in her stomach. She thought she needed to use the restroom. Since the restroom was nearby, she decided to tell her dad she'd go by herself and be back soon. The hallway was now eerily silent and empty. Nana's footsteps echoed against the tiled floor as she approached the women's restroom at the end of the corridor. Just as she reached for the door, a voice.
Nana.
She froze. That voice. It sounded just like her mother's. She turned toward the flickering light of the narrow passage. There, standing in the dim shadows, was a woman.
Mom? Is that you?
Nana couldn't see her face clearly enough to be sure. The woman, eerily resembling Nana's mother, insisted on taking her to a cleaner restroom at the end of the hallway. Despite her confusion, Nana felt an inexplicable pull and followed the mysterious woman. The woman walked ahead of her. The flickering lights of the corridor briefly revealed glimpses of her. She wore a long white silk blouse, stained with dark patches. Her hands and legs bore scratches. She led Nana to a small white door, opening it to reveal an old, dimly lit restroom. The mirror on the wall caught Nana's attention. It felt strange. In the dim, flickering light, she saw her mother's face, pale, ghostly skin, eyes wide like an owl, and a chilling smile as Nana stood before the mirror. Feeling uneasy, Nana turned and said,
Mom, can you wait outside? I can't go if you're staring at me like that.
The woman assured Nana she would wait and that she had a surprise for her, then immediately shut the door. Nana hesitated but nodded before stepping toward the sink. But when she glanced back at the mirror, her stomach dropped. Her reflection was no longer her own. Instead, Nana saw a terrifying girl about her age, with deep black eyes and an unnaturally wide mouth. Then, the girl's mouth slowly closed, and she spoke to Nana, warning her to leave. She told Nana that the woman outside was not her mother, and urged her to find her father. If she didn't, Nana would meet the same fate as her. Nana wanted to move, but she was frozen with fear as she heard her mother's voice from outside the restroom door, urging her to come out. The girl's eyes wept black ink like liquid, her sobs echoing. She continued warning Nana, telling her that the woman outside was a deranged murderer. The woman outside banged violently on the door. Nana felt trapped, her mind torn between the two opposing voices. The doorknob twisted forcefully, but just in time, Nana lunged forward and locked the door from the inside as the woman outside tried to force it open. Nana collapsed onto the floor, covering her ears and sobbing, "Stop it."
Stop it! Please stop! Dad, help me!
And then, she didn't know when she lost consciousness. The sound of machines filled the air as Nana woke up in a hospital. Her father sat beside her, his face pale and trembling. Her father recounted that after realizing Nana had been gone too long, he searched for her with the security team and found her lying on the floor of an abandoned restroom. After reporting it to the stadium management, they uncovered a horrifying truth. A year ago, a mentally ill woman had taken her daughter's life in that very restroom before ending her own. Though shaken, Nana felt grateful that the trapped spirit of the little girl in the mirror had tried to save her from the same fate. Both she and her father prayed that the ghostly girl who saved Nana could now finally rest in peace. Highway Trapmaker. It had been a long day of driving for me. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearly 9 p.m. I stopped at a small gas station, dimly lit, filled up the tank, and bought an energy drink from the store. The cool night air brushed against my face as I stretched before climbing back into the truck. With a 3-hour drive ahead, I settled into the seat, ready for the journey. The open road stretched out before me, desolate, bathed in the soft glow of the headlights. My only companion was the music playing through the cabin. I drifted a bit, feeling slightly drowsy, and quickly focused back on the road, allowing my mind to wander as I sipped my drink, hoping it would help keep me awake. Around 11 p.m., a sudden crackle pulled me from my drowsiness. The sound came from the radio I had on the trucker channel. With everything so quiet, the noise startled me. Through the static, I thought I heard a voice, faint and unclear. The words were difficult to make out, but it sounded like hello or help. My heart raced a little faster as I glanced around, looking into the darkness behind the headlights, but there were no other vehicles in sight. I grabbed the radio and pressed the button, my voice trembling as I asked, "Is anyone out there? Do you need help?" I waited, listening to the static fill the silence, but there was no response. Just as I was about to release the button, my headlights caught something ahead on the road. I slowed the truck down, coming to a stop as I saw a large rig parked in the middle of the road, motionless. It was strange. There were no signs of anyone around, no lights, nothing at all. I pulled over to the side and climbed out, the chill of the night air making me shiver. As I approached the rig, I called out, my voice breaking the strange silence. "Hello? Is anyone there?" But my voice was swallowed by the emptiness around me. I climbed into the open door of the truck and looked inside. My heart sank as I realized it was empty. There was no one inside. The driver's seat vacant, but a jacket hung over the passenger seat, a half-finished cup of coffee in the holder. The radio was silent now, but a faint static still lingered in the air. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no clues as to where they had gone. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave this place, a growing sense of unease gnawing at me. I stepped away from the rig, scanning my surroundings, my eyes sweeping over the dark fields on either side of the road. The tall grass swayed, casting eerie shadows that shifted under the moonlight. Then something peculiar caught my eye, a faded photo pinned to the dashboard. I squinted in the dim light, leaning in for a closer look. It was a family photo, the kind you might get at a cheap roadside stand. A man stood with his wife and daughter, smiling, carefree. I didn't recognize the man, but there was something in his expression that filled me with a sense of sadness. I stepped back, my gaze lingering on the photo as a chill ran down my spine. That's when I realized this truck wasn't just abandoned. Perhaps it was a trap, deliberately left here to lure someone, anyone, into this desolate stretch of road. A twig snapped behind me, the sudden noise cutting through the night like a knife. My instincts kicked in, and I whipped around just in time to see a figure emerging from the darkness, their face obscured. My heart raced as I took a step back, my mind scrambling for a plan. I was alone, isolated, surrounded only by trees and an empty highway. I couldn't run. He would catch me in seconds. Thinking quickly, I scrambled back into the empty truck, my hands shaking as I rummaged through the cabin. I found a wrench on the floor and gripped it tightly, crouching down inside the truck, preparing myself as I listened for approaching footsteps. The figure approached the open door, his face finally illuminated by the moonlight. He was grinning widely, a cold, threatening smile that made me shudder, and I realized with horrifying clarity that he had done this before. He stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately, savoring the fear in my eyes. But I wouldn't go down without a fight. I charged at him, swinging the wrench with all my might, catching him off guard. We stumbled out of the truck, struggling on the ground. The night came alive with the sounds of our scuffle, grunts and the scrape of shoes on the gravel. He was stronger than I was, but desperation fueled me, making me fight harder, faster. I tried to break free, staggering to my feet as he pulled back, clutching his shoulder. For a moment, we just stared at each other, both of us breathing heavily, the tension thick and suffocating. I gripped the wrench tightly, ready, but he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his face. I seized on his hesitation, advancing with the wrench raised. He stepped back, the threat in his eyes replaced with something else, perhaps fear. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, the sound of his footsteps fading until there was nothing but silence. I climbed back into my truck, locking the doors as I settled into the seat, my hands still trembling from what had just happened. I reached for the radio, my voice barely above a whisper as I called for help, my words spilling out in a rush. I told them everything: the abandoned truck, the photo, the man who attacked me. They assured me that help was on the way, that the police would be there soon. The flashing lights of the police car cut through the night, a relief after feeling like the darkness stretched on forever. I watched as the officers investigated the scene, their flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. One of the officers approached me, his expression grim as he recounted what they had found. The truck belonged to a man reported missing weeks ago. A man with a family, a wife and young daughter. They suspected foul play, but there was currently no sign of him. The man, they found footprints leading into the woods, but they ended abruptly, as if he had vanished into thin air. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed him, leaving nothing but an unsettling silence. The sun began to rise as I sat in the truck. The police had temporarily concluded their investigation, saying they would keep me updated, that they would do everything they could to find the missing man and bring the attacker to justice. I took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but I knew one thing: I had survived that night and escaped the trap he had set. A few days later, I was called to the police station to discuss the investigation. A policeman sat across from me, his eyes serious as he flipped through a thick stack of papers. He explains that they have identified both the attacker and the missing man, piecing together the details of a dark plot. The attacker, a vagrant with a violent history, was responsible for a series of disappearances along this stretch of highway. He preyed on both truckers and tourists, luring them in with abandoned cars, like the one I found, using them as bait to satisfy his twisted sense of control. The man in the photo is one of his victims, but this time, the attacker did not escape. After he ran away from me that night, he made a mistake, leaving behind clues that led the police to him. They find him hiding in an old, dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town, the walls covered with memorabilia stolen from his victims. The officer who showed me the photo from the abandoned truck, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag, told me they would notify the victim's family. I stared at the photo, feeling a mixture of relief and bitterness, knowing that this monster would no longer haunt the highway, no longer tear apart the lives of innocent people. Betrayal in the dark. It was a quiet night in late October. Maya was patrolling the empty streets of a small Texas town. The air carried a heavy, eerie stillness as the early morning hours approached. But that night, at around 2:15 a.m., the radio crackled to life. Maya received a call. Maya picked up the radio, and a woman's voice came through on the other end.
Police, please. I think there's someone in my house.
Maya could hear the woman's frantic, shallow breathing. But just as she was about to respond, the line went dead. She tried calling back, but it went straight to voicemail. Maya radioed a colleague to get the location. She stopped, squinting at her GPS. It was just a few blocks away, near the town's edge. Something about the woman's voice unsettled her, so she decided to check it out. Maya arrived at the location, but there was nothing, just an empty lot. The wind whistled softly, rustling through the tall, dry grass. She checked her GPS again. The location was correct, but there was no house, just emptiness. In the distance, a faint light flickered on the porch of an old farmhouse. Maya felt an odd pull toward it. She decided to walk to the farmhouse, thinking maybe they knew something. She parked and approached the door. Maya knocked, and after a few minutes, the door creaked open. A young man answered, looking tired, confused, and not at all like someone who had made a frantic emergency call.
"Can I help you, officer?"
he asked, squinting at Maya through the dim porch light. She explained the call, asking if he had seen or heard anything unusual. He shook his head, confusion plain on his face. She asked if he knew anyone else living nearby. The man slowly shook his head.
"No, there haven't been any houses for miles."
Maya thanked him and returned to her car, a deep unease settling in her stomach. Maya checked her radio again and tried calling the number one more time, but it still went straight to voicemail. She decided to head back to the station, but as Maya turned the key in the ignition, something caught her eye in the rearview mirror. Someone was sitting in the backseat. She could only see a faint silhouette, a hunched figure barely visible in the darkness. Maya's heart pounded as she tried to stay calm, reaching for her radio to call for backup. But before she could, a sharp blow struck the back of her head. Pain exploded. Her vision and everything around her faded into darkness. Maya woke up groggy, her head throbbing. Her hands were tied, and the air smelled of damp wood and rust. A single light bulb swung overhead, casting long, jagged shadows. Then, Maya saw her. It was her colleague, Jeff. Her face twisted into a manic grin, her eyes gleaming with cruelty.
You didn't expect to see me, did you? I've been waiting for this.
She continued, pacing with a gleaming knife in hand.
Do you know how long I had to smile while everyone adored you, Maya?
While I was stuck dealing with scraps, she lunged, pressing the blade close to Maya's face, taunting her about always being so calm. She wanted to see just how calm Maya would stay now. The cuts weren't deep, but they stung. Blood trickled down Maya's skin as Jeff mocked her, savoring every moment. Maya waited, biding her time. Jeff's grip on the knife loosened slightly as she got lost in her own rage. When she leaned in too close, Maya struck. She kicked Jeff's shin with all her strength, making her stumble. Maya's hands were still tied, but she used her shoulder to slam Jeff into the wall. The knife clattered to the floor. Jeff was dazed, giving Maya just enough time to grab it.
I feel sorry for you, Jeff.
Then, Maya bolted. Behind her, Jeff staggered out, screaming Maya's name, but her voice grew fainter as Maya sprinted toward her patrol car. Maya stumbled into the police station, covered in blood but alive. Her colleagues rushed toward her, their faces a mix of shock and concern. Maya told them everything. Jeff was arrested. She sat calmly, as if nothing had happened, but her eyes still carried pure malice. A few weeks later, Maya drove past the place where it all began. But now, she understood. Sometimes the monsters we fear don't hide in the darkness. They stand right beside us, wearing friendly faces. The hunter and the burial are in the forest. Kevin, a hunter, decided to spend some time alone in the vast, untouched forests of Arizona. As the sun set and he finished setting up his tent, the crackling fire was the only sound breaking the silence. However, the stillness of the forest was soon disturbed by something strange. During the night, Kevin began hearing whispers. At first, he dismissed them as natural sounds of the forest, but they grew louder, making it nearly impossible for him to sleep. As the hours passed and morning arrived, Kevin shook it off and ventured deeper into the forest. A hunter's instinct left no room for fear. While exploring the forest, Kevin saw a dirty shoe, half buried in the soil. At first, he thought it was just trash, but then he realized there were bones. Digging around, he found scattered bones, resembling a graveyard of death. He tried convincing himself they belonged to animals, but deep inside, he felt something far darker was happening here. As he moved on around midday, he found remnants of a torn piece of clothing dangling eerily from tree roots, emitting a foul, sickening odor. Kevin knew that if his suspicions were correct, if this was a crime scene, the killer would surely return. He decided to come back the following night. Fully prepared, Kevin brought small, hidden cameras, the kind that could blend with leaves or be placed on high branches to capture footage. He also found a secure spot to observe without being seen. As night fell, Kevin retreated to his hiding spot. Hours passed in silence, with only the sound of insects chirping. Then suddenly, footsteps. His heart pounded as he listened to the rustling leaves and snapping branches. Someone or something was moving. Through the dim glow of the moonlight, Kevin saw a man emerge from the trees. He wore a dark hoodie, his face hidden in the shadows. He carried 2 large black garbage bags, dripping with moisture, perhaps another package. His movements were precise, methodical, as if he had done this hundreds of times before. He stepped into the burial site, crouched down, and glanced at a piece of paper, muttering something. It was the note Kevin had planted near the area. "I know who you are. Be careful." A bait to provoke a reaction from the killer. The man panicked, looking around frantically, his breath quickening as if he were afraid. He turned away and began leaving the area, following a narrow trail deeper into the forest. Kevin waited until he was far enough, then silently followed, stepping lightly like a hunter stalking its prey. The path grew increasingly difficult, surrounded by thick tree trunks. After about 20 minutes of walking, Kevin spotted an old, rotting wooden cabin hidden deep in the dense forest. The man's flashlight flickered inside. Kevin pressed himself against a nearby tree, trying to get a clearer view of what was happening. What he saw inside was far more horrifying than he had imagined. Blood-stained old clothes hung on a line, a table with scattered bone fragments, remnants of something he didn't want to think about. Then, a large freezer sat ominously in the corner, seemingly holding something inside. Kevin knew he couldn't confront this man directly. He looked dangerous, far from an easy match. Kevin realized he needed to stay sharp. Quietly, he placed one of his cameras just outside, aimed at the entrance. Then, he strung a piece of wire across the pathway. If stepped on, it would send a large branch crashing down, making a loud noise. Moments later, the man stepped out of the cabin, gripping a large knife. He took a few steps forward and triggered the trap. The branch came crashing down with a loud thud, startling him. In his panic, he stumbled over a tree root and fell hard to the ground. Kevin didn't hesitate. He quickly retreated, taking the recorded footage with him. Kevin didn't report to the police, but he had his own plan. The next morning, he posted a series of images from the scene on an online forum dedicated to mysterious disappearances, along with an anonymous message. The post spread quickly. People who had lost loved ones in the area took notice. An amateur search party decided to enter the forest and investigate. The killer realized he had been exposed. He tried to flee, but there was nowhere left to hide. Cornered and out of options, he lost control and ended his own life in the very cabin he once used as a hideout. Mysterious man on the cruise ship. Our large family gathered for dinner, celebrating my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. The ship was filled with laughter and chatter as we enjoyed dinner on the last night of our cruise. This was my first time on a cruise. My sister, cousins, and I were incredibly excited, running around the ship. After dinner, the adults stayed behind to play and chat, while the kids headed up to the deck to enjoy the quiet night, eager to experience one last bit of adventure before bed. The night was perfect. The sky was covered in a blanket of stars, clearer and more than anywhere I had ever seen before. The ship glided gently through the dark waters as we lounged on the deck, sharing scary stories. But that peace was quickly shattered. Around 11:30 p.m., we decided to head to the game room, and I noticed him a solitary figure sitting near the railing. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair sticking out from under a winter hat, despite the warm night air. His long coat seemed out of place, and his head tilted slightly, as if he were either sleeping or staring out to sea. I was the last to pass by him, and as I walked by, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder to watch him. He remained still, but then I heard his voice. It was more of a mumble, deep and fragmented, almost inaudible over the sound of the ship gliding through the water. When I turned back, the man was standing up. He took a step towards me, his face now only partially illuminated by the dim lights on the deck, gaunt, with deep-set eyes in the darkness. In his outstretched hand, he held something and asked if I wanted to buy it. I looked down at what he was holding, a small, crude voodoo doll, with button eyes sewn on and limbs twisted unnaturally. I gasped, and without thinking further, I declined and left for the bright, noisy game room, a stark contrast to the eerie silence above. Suddenly, the door leading into the game room creaked open. I felt a chilling sea breeze brush against my skin. I turned back and saw him there. The tall man from the deck had followed me inside. He stood in the doorway, staring at me. I didn't wait for him to approach and urged my sister and cousins to leave the area. We hurried out of the game room, making our way towards the lounge where the adults were chatting and playing. Once inside, my parents kissed us goodnight, and we began to head back to our room to prepare for bed. The room was small but cozy. I lay on the bed, the soothing sound of the engine lulling us into a sense of safety. I tried to forget the man's face, the way he stared at me, the strange voodoo doll he tried to sell. The gentle rocking of the ship quickly put us to sleep, but it didn't last long. Around 1 a.m., I was jolted awake by a horrifying scream. It was my sister. When I turned on the light, I saw him there. The man from the deck was sitting in the corner of our room, hunched over one of the chairs, his knees nearly touching his chin due to his height. Then he slowly stood up. Before we could react, he stumbled over his own feet, crashing into the bathroom. I ran over and slammed the bathroom door shut. We quickly barricaded the door with a chair. We screamed for help. Our parents rushed over and immediately called for ship security, who arrived within minutes, hands ready to cuff. The security team opened the bathroom door, dragging the tall man out. His eyes were wild, and he mumbled incoherently, his long limbs flailing awkwardly as they restrained him. We later learned that the man was not a registered passenger on the ship. He wasn't on the manifest, and no one could figure out how he got on board. They suspected he had some sort of mental disorder. When they tried to question him, he barely responded, and they locked him in a holding cell below deck for the remainder of the trip. I returned to my room and lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. Even though the man was now locked below deck, an unsettling anxiety still enveloped me. Hours passed, and sleep came in short, restless bursts. I jolted awake again, this time to a faint noise, At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then I heard it again, a faint dragging sound, as if something was being pulled across the floor. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, replaced by a slow creaking. My heart raced. It was coming from the bathroom. I sat up, my hands gripping the edge of the bed. The bathroom door was ajar, and I stared at it, but there was nothing, just the open door and a chilling silence. I gathered my courage and swung my legs off the bed. I slowly walked toward the bathroom. As I reached the door, my hand trembled. I pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, but on the floor, just inside the doorway, was a voodoo doll. I gasped, stumbling back. The doll was still there, its stitched eyes seeming to glare at me from the floor. I bent down, hesitating before picking it up. The doll was made of coarse, dirty fabric, its stitching uneven, and it felt heavier than it should, as if it carried something dark. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, just like before when the man had given it to me on the deck, as if the doll itself were alive, trying to say something to me. I dropped the doll, my hand trembling. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and a cold gust of wind swept through, even though no windows were open. My breath quickened as I stared, frozen in place. The doll began to move. It slowly slid across the floor, getting closer to my bed. Then suddenly, my bedroom door swung open, revealing the tall man standing in the doorway, his gaunt figure silhouetted by the dim hallway light. His eyes no longer held the wildness they once had. Instead, they were empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered as if responding to an unseen force. The man took a step closer, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. In a panic, I pushed the man with all my strength, and to my surprise, he fell to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. But even as he lay there, motionless, the doll continued to move. Without hesitation, I grabbed the doll and ran to the window. My hands trembled as I tried to open it, but eventually, I managed to. The cold night air rushed in, and with all my strength, I threw the doll into the sea. The doll vanished into the dark waters below, swallowed by the depths of the ocean. For a moment, everything was silent. The whispers ceased, the lights flickered once more, and then everything fell still. The man on the floor suddenly vanished, his form seemingly dissolving into the air in an inexplicable manner. We stood there, stunned, unsure of what had just happened. I fell to the floor, trembling. Perhaps it was all over. The nightmare was finally over. The next morning, we packed up our things and left the room without looking back. When I reached the desk, the cruise staff looked puzzled as we recounted our encounter with the man, who had been found dead right there for no apparent reason. It had happened suddenly. I sensed that he and that doll had some connection that I couldn't comprehend. As I stepped off the ship, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man, whatever he was, and the doll carried something dark, and that we were the targets. I could still feel its chilling touch on my skin, and deep down, I knew we had escaped something far worse than we could comprehend. Fake stalkers. This happened a few years ago. Liz was home alone for the weekend while her parents attended a wedding, and she had invited a friend over, Maya. Maya, who lived just behind Liz's house, agreed to come over. Liz prepared snacks and tea, looking forward to a fun and relaxing day. About 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. However, it wasn't a normal ring. The person at the door was pressing it urgently, as if in a hurry. When she reached the door and asked,
"Who's there?"
a rushed voice responded,
"Maya."
When Liz opened the door, she saw Maya standing there, looking disheveled and breathless. She rushed inside, visibly shaking with fear. Liz quickly led her inside and handed her a glass of water, then asked what had happened. Maya explained that while walking to Liz's house, she had noticed a man staring at her, smiling. Although she tried to ignore him and keep walking, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was following her. She turned around to check if the man was still there, and he was following her. Panicked, she ran to Liz's house, hoping to lose him. But by the time she arrived, the man had vanished. Liz reassured her friend that she was safe inside. They carried on with their plans for the day, but Maya remained uneasy, unable to shake off the fear from her encounter. After a while, both girls got hungry and decided to order a pizza. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Liz assumed it was the pizza delivery, so she got up to answer it. Liz walked toward the door.
Who is it?
She called, gripping the doorknob.
Pizza delivery, ma'am.
Just as she was about to turn the knob, a piercing scream from upstairs shattered the silence. Maya suddenly screamed from upstairs.
Liz, don't open the door.
Her voice filled with panic. Maya rushed down the stairs, yanking Liz away from the door with terrifying force. Liz barely had time to process what was happening before she was pulled back. Startled and confused, she demanded to know what was going on. With fear in her eyes, Maya began explaining everything. She said she had looked out the window and saw the same man who had followed her earlier. Now, he was standing at the door, waiting for them to open it. She believed he had been stalking them and was impersonating the pizza delivery man. Liz hesitated, wondering if Maya was overreacting. Maybe she was just paranoid after all. It was nearly impossible to see his face clearly in the darkness. Maya gripped her wrist tightly, her face pale as she saw Liz stepping toward the door.
Liz, don't. I saw him. It's him. It's the same man.
She took a step toward the door. The man spoke.
I saw you run. Don't leave. Open the door and take your pizza.
Liz froze. The man's words sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly, she remembered. Earlier that night, while watching Netflix, she had seen something move outside before they even ordered food. A shadow, a flicker, just for a second. But she had ignored it. Maybe it had been him. Snapping back to reality, Liz realized the door was now shaking violently. Maya dragged Liz upstairs into a bedroom and locked the door. The two girls huddled together, listening in terror. The man started pounding on the door, screaming for them to open it. The banging and his increasingly deranged voice sent chills through them. Overwhelmed with fear, Liz immediately called the police. All they could do was sit there, crying and praying for help. After what felt like forever, they heard police sirens. Finally, the man was caught. Liz and Maya were escorted out safely. The police informed them that they had found the body of a murdered pizza delivery driver. His uniform jacket had been stolen, used as a disguise. They had no idea what his true intentions were, but they were lucky. If Maya hadn't recognized him in time, they both might have been his next unfortunate victims. Nightmare House on the Hillside. A new beginning Lucy, a 7-year-old girl, moved with her family to an old suburban house. It was a historic home built in the mid-1800s. The house was 2 stories tall with a basement below. Down there was a locked door leading to water tanks used to heat the house. Only her mother and the landlord had the key. They warned her never to go near it. Lucy never understood why her room was always colder than the others, even though it was right above the basement. At night, she often heard strange creaking sounds, as if someone were walking on the floor, whispers, and distant footsteps pacing in the living room. The house was old and worn. She also frequently saw wasps emerging from the attic, swarming as if drawn to something. She wasn't the only one experiencing strange things. Her parents often heard footsteps late at night, pacing endlessly, but they dismissed it as nothing. One night, she woke up with an eerie feeling as if someone was in the room with her. Lucy turned over and saw a boy, his face hidden in the shadows. He wore old-fashioned clothes and stood near her desk. Lucy sat up in bed. The boy spoke, asking if she wanted to play with him. She refused, saying it was too late and she didn't want to get in trouble. His expression changed. He looked angry. In the blink of an eye, he vanished into the cold darkness of the room. Lucy ran to tell her mother, but she reassured her that it was just a dream. Still, Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house. The next night, it happened again, but this time, it was worse. She woke up, unable to move. But this time, it was someone else, a woman in a black dress. She stood on Lucy's bed, her bare feet pressing into the blanket, long nails cracked and jagged. The woman bent down, her tangled hair falling over Lucy's face. She couldn't see her features, her wild hair obscured them. Then the woman stared at her, with hollow, blackened eyes. Her breath, ice cold, brushed against Lucy's skin. Lucy sprang up, threw open the door, and rushed to her sister's room. Her baby sister was still asleep in her crib. She had to make sure she was safe. She turned back to the door and saw the woman slowly stepping toward her. As she passed the window, a flash of lightning struck outside. For a brief second, the woman vanished. With each flicker of light, she reappeared closer and closer. Lucy woke up drenched in sweat, trying to piece together what had just happened. She ran to her mother and told her everything. Her mother's face turned pale as Lucy spoke, but in the end, she simply said it was just a nightmare, a lie one she had been telling since they moved in. Within days, the family moved out. Lucy's mother never gave them a reason. It wasn't until years later that Lucy finally dared to ask. The landlord eventually admitted what had happened in that house long ago. A widowed mother and her 3 children had once lived there. Their family had been happy together. During the Civil War, the mother had become a widow, and she and her 3 children remained in the house for a long time. After her husband died in battle, her mind shattered. In a fit of madness, she killed everyone else in the family right there in the living room, before dragging them down to the water storage room in the basement, the very place they had been warned never to go near. This explained everything Lucy had experienced: the misplaced toys, the shifting objects in her room. The boy Lucy had seen was one of her children, still trapped in the house, searching for a companion or perhaps revenge. And the woman, the one who stood on her bed, was the mother, her spirit twisted by the horror she had committed. Lucy often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed in that house. Would they have become part of its story? Would the woman have done to them what she had done to her own children? She would never know. But sometimes, in the dead of night, she found herself thinking about that house on the hill and the dark secrets it held.